There is a moment, and perhaps you know it well, when your body simply refuses. Not in the dramatic way we imagine collapse, not with fanfare or obvious crisis, but quietly, stubbornly, like a door that will no longer open no matter how hard you push. You wake up and the exhaustion is already there, waiting for you, heavier than sleep. You sit at the table or the desk, or wherever life has positioned you, and the ordinary tasks that once moved through your hands with some semblance of ease now feel like requests made in a foreign language. You understand the words. You know what is being asked, and yet something in you will not move. Something has gone still. Most people, when this happens, go to the doctor, or they push harder, telling themselves this is laziness, weakness, a character flaw dressed up as fatigue. They change their diet, their sleep schedule, their supplements. They read about burnout and nod at the symptoms the way one nods at a diagnosis that fits, but does not quite explain the deeper wrongness. Because the body stopping, the real stopping, is not primarily a physical event. That is what I want to explore with you today. What is actually happening when the body refuses to continue? What is actually screaming when we think it is the body doing the screaming? The conventional story goes something like this. You overworked yourself. You did not rest enough. Your cortisol is elevated and your nervous system is taxed, and now your body is sending you a signal to slow down. This story is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously, because it positions the body as the primary speaker and it positions the solution as physical restoration. Rest more, stress less, eat better, and then, presumably, the machinery will restart and you can return to the life you were living before the breakdown. The problem, the deep and honest problem, is that the life you were living before the breakdown was precisely what needed to stop. The body did not fail. The body succeeded. It did the one thing that consciousness, left to its own relentless momentum, could not do for itself. It stopped. If this perspective is opening something up for you, consider subscribing. I explore these territories every week, and I would love to have you along for the journey. To understand what I mean, we need to think carefully about the relationship between the body and consciousness. Not in the way neuroscience talks about it, though neuroscience has useful things to say, but in the phenomenological sense. What is it like to be a body that thinks? What is it like to be a consciousness that lives inside flesh? Because there is a strange and under-examined tension at the heart of human experience. We are not simply minds that happen to have bodies, nor are we simply bodies that happen to produce minds. We are something stranger and more integrated than either of those descriptions allows. And when one part of that integration reaches its limit, the whole system registers the protest. Hannah Arendt, whose thinking I have always found clarifying precisely because she refused to let abstraction float free of human reality, wrote extensively about what she called the vita activa, the active life, the life defined by labor and work and action. She distinguished these three carefully. Labor is what we do to sustain biological life, the daily maintenance of existence. Work is what we do to create a world that outlasts us, the building and making of things with some permanence. And action is the most distinctly human of the three, the capacity to begin something new, to insert ourselves into the world through words and deeds. What Arendt noticed, and what she worried about in the modern age, was the degree to which one mode of existence had come to dominate all the others. The laboring animal, as she called it, the human being reduced to the cycle of production and consumption, need and satisfaction, effort and exhaustion, had crowded out the space for genuine action and genuine thought. What does this have to do with the body stopping? Everything. Because when we speak of burnout, of collapse, of the body refusing, we are almost always speaking about a person who has been living almost entirely in the register of labor. Not necessarily physical labor, though sometimes that too, but the endless maintenance cycle that modern life demands. Produce, consume, rest just enough to produce again. Meet the needs that arise just enough to meet the next round of needs. The modern economy of selfhood runs on this rhythm, and most of us have internalized it so completely that we mistake it for the shape of life itself. We do not notice that we have reduced ourselves to the laboring animal Arendt described, because everyone around us is doing the same, and the culture celebrates it, rewards it, and calls it productivity. I know many of you watching this have never told anyone how completely exhausted you are, not just physically, but existentially. You have been running on a kind of hollow momentum for longer than you can remember. You keep doing the things you are supposed to do, meeting the obligations, maintaining the surfaces, and inside there is this growing silence where meaning used to be. You have not talked about it because you do not quite have words for it. It does not feel like sadness exactly or anxiety exactly. It feels more like a question that has no language yet. Let me ask you directly. When did you last feel genuinely alive in your own life? Not productive, not useful, not accomplishing, but simply alive. I want you to share that in the comments below. Not because I need engagement, but because someone else watching this is asking themselves the same question, and they need to know they are not alone in the asking. If words feel hard right now, just type this: I lost the thread. That is enough. Because when you name it, even partially, you stop being alone with it, and your honesty gives others permission to be honest too. Now back to the body, because we need to understand something important about why the body is the one that finally refuses, rather than the mind. The mind, particularly in intelligent and driven people, has an extraordinary capacity for dissociation. It can observe suffering and file it away under something to address later. It can recognize exhaustion and override it with narrative. I just need to get through this week, this month, this season, this phase. The mind is a meaning maker, and it is remarkably good at making meaning out of continued motion. There is always a reason to keep going, always a goal on the horizon, always a story in which the current difficulty is justified by some future reward. The mind can maintain this story indefinitely, or at least until the body can no longer support it. The body does not have access to these stories. The body lives only in the present moment, only in the actual conditions of this breath, this heartbeat, this particular configuration of stress hormones and depleted resources. The body cannot be talked into continuing when it has genuinely reached its limit. It cannot be reasoned with, cannot be shown the 5-year plan, cannot be persuaded that what is happening right now is worth it for some future outcome. The body simply is what it is, in the moment that it is it. And when it has been pushed past what it can sustain, it stops. Not to punish you, not because it is weak, but because it is the only honest part of you left. This is the radical reframe I want to offer you today. The body stopping is not a failure of the body. It is a success of a deeper intelligence that you have been unable to access through conscious effort alone. The body is not the one screaming. Consciousness is screaming. The body is the medium through which that scream finally becomes audible, because consciousness, trapped in its own stories about what must happen next, has no other way to make itself heard. Think about this carefully. What is consciousness actually communicating when it forces the system to a halt? It is communicating that something essential has been violated, not just rest, not just physical recovery, but something more fundamental. The conditions for genuine human life, as opposed to the simulation of life that productivity culture provides, have been absent for too long. The conditions for thought, for genuine relationship, for the kind of action Arendt described, the insertion of something genuinely new into the world, something that comes from a place of authentic freedom rather than conditioned response. Consciousness is not asking for a vacation, it is asking for a life. And because you have not known how to give it one, because you have not been taught that such a thing is even possible, it has had to use the body as its last available microphone. There is a woman I think of sometimes, not someone I will name, but someone whose situation illustrates what I am trying to describe with great precision. She was, by every external measure, a success. Competent, accomplished, admired by colleagues, loved by her family. She ran her household and her career with remarkable efficiency. And then one morning she could not get out of bed. Not would not. Could not. The distinction matters. Her body, which had been the instrument of all that efficiency, simply refused. She went to doctors. She had tests. Nothing definitive was found, or rather what was found was consistent with severe exhaustion and stress responses, which did not feel like a discovery to her because she had known she was exhausted and stressed. What the medical system could not tell her was what she was actually experiencing, which was not a broken body but a consciousness in revolt. When she finally stopped trying to fix the physical symptoms and began to ask what her inner life was actually trying to communicate, the answers were not subtle. She had spent 30 years doing what was expected of her, meeting the needs of others, fulfilling the roles assigned to her, maintaining the performance of competence and togetherness. And somewhere underneath all of that, something genuinely hers, something that belonged to no role and no expectation, had been waiting. Not waiting patiently, it turned out. Waiting desperately. The body stopping was consciousness finally saying, "I cannot wait any longer. You must stop. You must listen. Something real needs to happen here." What needed to happen was not dramatic. She did not need to quit her job and move to a monastery. She needed, in Arendt's language, to move from the vita activa into the vita contemplativa, even briefly, even imperfectly. She needed to stop producing and start thinking. Not planning, not problem-solving, not optimizing. Thinking in the older, slower sense. Sitting with questions, allowing herself not to know. Paying attention to what was actually alive in her, underneath the accumulated obligations and performances, and asking it what it needed. This is harder than it sounds. We are trained at every level of modern life to be uncomfortable with not doing. Stillness feels like failure. Thinking for its own sake, without a deliverable, without an outcome, feels indulgent or even dangerous. We fill our silences with screens, our gaps with content, our pauses with productivity. And so when consciousness tries to speak in the language of stillness, we immediately try to translate it back into the language of action. How do I fix this? What is the solution? What are the steps? We turn the invitation to stop into another project to complete. But here is what you must understand. The body stopping is not a problem to be solved. It is information to be received. And receiving information, genuine information, requires a kind of quiet that our ordinary way of being in the world does not permit. Arendt called this thinking, and she distinguished it sharply from cognition, from problem-solving, from the accumulation of knowledge. Thinking, in her sense, is the activity of examining experience from the inside, of questioning the assumptions one has been living by, of attending to the invisible currents that run beneath the surface of a life. It is not productive. It does not generate an output. And it is precisely what modern life has made almost impossible to do. So we find ourselves in a strange situation. The very capacity that would allow us to understand what consciousness is trying to communicate has been systematically suppressed by the conditions that caused the breakdown in the first place. We stop, but we do not know how to be still. We rest the body, but we continue to run the mind. We take the vacation but spend it planning the return. We meditate, but turn meditation into a performance of meditating. We go to therapy, but treat it as a project with goals and timelines. The culture of doing is so deeply embedded that even our attempts at not doing become forms of doing. The first movement toward genuine recovery, toward actually hearing what consciousness is screaming, is therefore not a practice or a technique. It is a recognition. The recognition that something in you is trying to communicate something real, that the breakdown is not random or meaningless, but deeply intentional in the sense that it is pointing at something specific, something about the gap between the life you have been living and the life that consciousness recognizes as genuinely yours. That gap is not a small thing. For most people who experience the kind of collapse we are discussing, the gap is enormous. It represents years or decades of choices made from obligation rather than genuine desire, of selves constructed to meet others' expectations rather than inner truth, of enormous creative and emotional energy channeled into maintaining a performance rather than living an actual life. The exhaustion is real and it is proportional. You are not tired because you worked too hard. You are tired because you worked too hard at the wrong thing, the maintenance of a self that was never quite real, in a life that was constructed from the outside in. Now, I want to be careful here, because this kind of analysis can slide into a different trap, the spiritual self-help trap that says your authentic self is somewhere beneath all the conditioning, pure and perfect and waiting to be released, and all you have to do is strip away the false layers, and there it will be. This is not what I'm saying, and it is not what is true. The self is not a thing you find, it is something you build continuously through the choices you make and the attention you bring. Arendt was deeply suspicious of the idea of a fixed inner self that simply needed to be uncovered. What she insisted on was the capacity for new beginnings, what she called natality, the human ability to start something genuinely new in the world, something that could not have been predicted from what came before. What consciousness is screaming for, in the body's stopping, is not the recovery of some authentic self that was always there. It is the permission and the capacity to begin again, not to return to who you were before the breakdown, because who you were before the breakdown was precisely the problem. Not to implement a better version of the same life, more sustainable, more balanced, optimized for longevity, but to actually reconsider the premises, to ask, with genuine openness and without the defensive anxiety that usually attaches to such questions, what is this life for? What am I actually here to do? Not in the cosmic sense that demands an answer too large to hold, but in the immediate, practical, humanly manageable sense. What wants to happen here, in this particular human life, with these particular capacities and limitations and loves? These are not comfortable questions. They are disturbing questions in the literal sense of the word. They disturb the settled arrangements. They unsettle what has been fixed. And the reason they feel so threatening is precisely that we already sense the answer might require change. Real change. Not the cosmetic adjustment of taking more breaks, but the structural reconsidering of what the life is organized around. Consciousness knows this, even when the rational mind refuses to look at it directly. And this is part of why the body has to be the one to force the stop, because only a genuine physical inability to continue creates the conditions in which those questions become unavoidable. If what I am sharing here resonates with something you have been feeling, something you have not quite been able to name, then I want you to know you are not alone in this. There are many of us exploring these questions, sitting with these uncomfortable truths, learning to see in new ways. I create these videos for people who are ready to go deeper, who are not satisfied with surface answers, who want to understand rather than just feel better temporarily. If that is you, consider subscribing. Not because you need another channel to follow, but because this journey of understanding yourself, of waking up to what is real, it helps to have companions along the way. People who will not offer you easy fixes but will sit with you in the questions. I will be here every week with another exploration, another perspective, another thread to pull on. And I would be honored to have you here as part of this community of seekers and thinkers. So if this feels right, hit that subscribe button. And if you found something in this particular exploration, let me know in the comments what resonated most with you. Your reflections often illuminate things I had not considered. Let us talk about what happens in the body during a genuine breakdown, because the physiology is actually philosophically interesting. When the nervous system has been chronically activated, when the stress response has been running for too long without genuine resolution, the body eventually shifts into a kind of shutdown mode. The technical language calls it hypoactivation or dorsal vagal response, the parasympathetic system's most ancient emergency protocol. Freeze, conserve, wait. It is not weakness. It is the body's most primitive form of intelligence, the kind of intelligence that predates complex consciousness by millions of years. When the system cannot fight and cannot flee, it goes still. It conserves its resources. It waits. What is extraordinary about this is that the body's most ancient response to overwhelm is stillness. Not more action, not a better strategy. Stillness. And in that stillness, something becomes possible that was not possible in the relentless motion. Awareness of what is actually present. Not what should be present, not what was present before or might be present in the future, but what is actually, undeniably, here right now. The sensations, the emotions, the thoughts that arise when nothing is being managed or performed or optimized, this is consciousness encountering itself, possibly for the first time in years, without the distorting lens of function and productivity. It is rarely pleasant. When consciousness meets itself after a long period of avoidance, the encounter tends to be painful. What comes up is often grief. Grief for the time lost, for the paths not taken, for the self that was set aside in service of what was required. Grief for relationships that were maintained at the surface, while genuine intimacy was starved. Grief for the creative life that was deferred, always deferred, until the circumstances were better and the time was right, and the permission finally arrived, none of which ever came because permission for a genuine life is never granted by external circumstances. It has to be claimed. And the grief is the recognition of all the years spent waiting for something that was never going to come from outside. This grief is not pathological. It is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can look like depression and sometimes becomes it. It is the appropriate response to genuine loss, and the mistake we make, the mistake that extends the breakdown unnecessarily, is trying to move through the grief too quickly. We want to get to the insight, to the lesson, to the transformation, without fully honoring the loss. We are again trying to turn a human experience into a project with deliverables. But grief requires time and presence, and the willingness to feel what is actually felt, not what it would be more comfortable to feel. Arendt wrote that the space of appearance, the place where we become visible to ourselves and others through our words and deeds, is fundamentally fragile. It can disappear. It can be destroyed by conditions that make genuine action impossible. And one of the quiet tragedies of modern life is that most people live in conditions that are subtly but consistently hostile to genuine self-appearance. They appear in roles, in functions, in performances. But the deeper self, the one that would have something genuinely new to say, if given the space to say it, rarely gets to appear at all. The breakdown, then, is also the collapse of the performance. The role can no longer be maintained, and in the painful absence of the performance, something more real becomes visible, both to the person experiencing the breakdown and sometimes uncomfortably to those around them. What becomes visible is not always flattering. Along with the grief comes the recognition of the ways one has participated in one's own suppression. No one forced you, or at least rarely, to set aside what was genuine in favor of what was required. The choice was made repeatedly, often invisibly, often in small moments that seemed inconsequential at the time. The creative project abandoned because the practical demand seemed more urgent. The honest conversation avoided because the relationship seemed too fragile to hold it. The desire dismissed because it seemed too inconvenient, too selfish, too uncertain. These small acts of self-erasure accumulate, and what the breakdown reveals is the accumulated cost of all that erasure. This is important to understand not as self-accusation, but as information. The same clear seeing that allows you to recognize what has been suppressed is also the capacity to choose differently going forward. And this is where natality, Arendt's concept of new beginnings, becomes not just philosophically interesting but practically essential. Because the question, once you have sat with the grief and the recognition, is not how to return to what was, but how to begin something genuinely new. How to organize a life around what is actually alive in you, rather than around what is expected of you. How to move from the laboring animal, endlessly cycling through need and satisfaction, into something more fully human. The answer to this question is not given by any formula or method. It is discovered through the very process of honest examination that the breakdown, paradoxically, makes possible. When the old life stops, when the performance is no longer maintainable, there is a strange and uncomfortable freedom that becomes available. The question of what to do next cannot be answered by consulting the old map, because the old map was precisely what led you here. You are in territory for which there is no established route, and this terrifying absence of guidance is also, if you can hold it without immediately trying to fill it, an extraordinary opportunity. The opportunity to find out, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, what you actually want. Not what you should want, not what you used to want before the world told you what to want, but what, in the quiet that remains when everything else has stopped, is still alive and insisting on its own reality. This is not a romantic idea. I am not suggesting that a breakdown is secretly wonderful or that suffering is a gift to be celebrated. Suffering is suffering. The body stopping is genuinely terrible in many of its dimensions. People lose jobs, relationships, years of their lives to these collapses. The costs are real. But within those costs, there is also something real being offered. Not automatically, not without effort and honesty and the courage to look at what the breakdown is revealing, but genuinely. The opportunity to reckon with the life one has been living and to begin, slowly and imperfectly, to construct something truer. There is a quality of attention that becomes available in extreme stillness that is simply not accessible in ordinary active life. We might call it witnessing. Not detachment, not the cold observation of a scientist examining a specimen, but the warm and honest attention of a consciousness that has finally stopped long enough to actually see what is in front of it. Seeing yourself clearly, without the defensive distortions that ordinarily protect the ego from uncomfortable truths, is both painful and liberating. Painful because what you see includes the ways you have betrayed yourself, the compromises that were too costly, the slow erosions of integrity that accumulated over years. Liberating because what you see is real, and reality, even difficult reality, is always more workable than illusion. The person who goes back to the same life after the breakdown, unchanged and unreflective, is not healed. They are merely recovered, repaired enough to continue the same cycle. And the sadness of this is that the breakdown will come again, perhaps harder, perhaps in different form, but it will come. Because the underlying conditions, the gap between the performed life and the actual life, has not been addressed. The body will stop again, because consciousness is still screaming, still insisting on being heard. This is not a threat or a judgment. It is simply the truth of what happens when the message is not received. The person who comes through the breakdown, genuinely transformed, is the one who is willing to receive the message in full. Not just the message that rest is needed, though rest is needed. Not just the message that stress must be reduced, though stress must be reduced. But the deeper message about the shape of a life, about what has been absent and what needs to be present, about the specific ways in which the authentic has been suppressed in favor of the functional, about what consciousness is actually for, which is not, it turns out, the efficient management of obligations, but the examination of experience, the creation of meaning, the capacity for genuine relationship and genuine action in the full Arendtian sense. You have stopped. Or you are stopping, or you sense that a stopping is approaching, or you recognize yourself in the description of someone who has been running for too long on hollow momentum. Wherever you are in this process, the stopping is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a conversation that your consciousness has been trying to have with you for a very long time. The question is whether you are finally willing to listen, not to fix what is broken, not to return as quickly as possible to the life you were living, but to actually hear what is being said, what needs to stop, what needs to begin, what in you has been waiting, patiently at first, and then desperately, for the permission to be real. The body stops not because it is failing, but because it is faithful. Faithful to a truth that the mind has been unwilling or unable to face. And in that faithfulness, in that extreme and inconvenient act of stopping, lies an invitation to something that many people spend their entire lives seeking and never quite finding: the honest encounter with their own existence. The moment when the noise of the performed life goes quiet enough that the actual life, with all its complexity and beauty and unmet needs, becomes audible. The moment when consciousness, having finally been heard, can begin to move again. Not in the same direction, not at the same speed, and not for the same reasons, but with something it has lacked for a very long time: reality, ground, the particular, irreplaceable aliveness of a self that is no longer running from what it actually is. You do not have to have it all figured out from here, no one does. The examined life that Arendt, following Socrates, believed was the only life worth living is not a destination. It is a practice, an ongoing willingness to look clearly at what is present and to ask honestly what it means. The body stopped. Consciousness spoke. What it said was not comfortable, but it was true. And truth, even painful truth, even truth that disrupts everything you thought you had arranged, is the only real foundation there is. Start there. Start with what you actually know, beneath the stories and the performances and the long history of doing what was required. Start with the quiet fact of your own experience now, in this particular moment of your particular life. That is where the new beginning is. It has always been there. And now, perhaps for the first time, you are still enough to see it.